All right, today we're cracking open one of the most influential, maybe one of the most controversial books ever written, Karl Marx's Capital. I mean, for over 150 years, this thing has been praised, it's been condemned, it's been argued over like crazy. But why does it still matter? Why are we still talking about it today? Well, let's dive in and find out.
And look, that's a really fair question, right? I mean, Marx was writing about factories and steam engines during the Industrial Revolution. So what could that possibly have to do with our world, with smartphones and social media? Well, as it turns out, a lot more than you might think.
Now check this out. This quote, it's not from some radical revolutionary. It's from a guy named George Magnus. He was a senior economic advisor at a huge investment bank, and he wrote this right in the middle of a global financial crisis. So when a top capitalist starts saying, hey, that communist philosopher kind of had a point, yeah, you know something's up.
And he definitely wasn't alone. After the 2008 crash, when the global economy was just teetering on the brink of collapse, people were desperate for answers. And you know what happened? Sales of Capital just skyrocketed. A whole new generation started picking up this old book and asking the same question. Okay, what did Marx have to say about all this?
Okay, so to really get why Capital made such a comeback, we've got to get under the hood of Marx's analysis. Let's take a look at what he saw as the engine that drives the whole capitalist system.
For Marx, it all starts with one simple idea, the commodity. And really, that's just anything that's made to be sold. But here's the twist he pointed out. He argued that under capitalism, the entire point of society fundamentally shifts. It's no longer about making things for people to use, it's about making things to sell for a profit. That's the game.
And that leads us to a really unique, a really special kind of commodity, labor power. It sounds complicated, but it's just a fancy way of saying your ability to work, your skills, your time, your energy. Marx's point was, if you don't own a factory or a business or land, the only thing you really have to sell to make a living is your labor power.
And this is where you can really see the two different worlds Marx described. On one side, you've got the worker. They start with a commodity, their own labor, sell it for money, and then use that money to buy other commodities, like food and rent. The goal is just to live, to get by. But then you've got the capitalist. They start with money, use it to buy commodities, labor, materials, the whole shebang, and then sell the new product for more money. The goal? Profit. It's a totally different cycle.
So, the big question is, where does that extra money, that profit, actually come from? Well, Marx had an answer. Surplus value. Here's how we broke it down. Let's say you're a worker. In the first few hours of your day, you produce enough value to cover your own wages. Great, but you don't get to go home. For the rest of the day, you keep working, you keep producing value. And all that extra value? That, according to Marx, is the surplus value, the profit that the capitalist gets to keep. This was the hidden secret, the engine of the entire system for him.
You gotta hand it to him. Marx was a powerful writer. He was not afraid to use some seriously dramatic language. He described capital, all the machinery, the factories, all of it, as dead labor from the past. And he said it was like a vampire, that it could only live by sucking the living labor out of workers in the present. Wow, I mean, that is a stark and pretty unforgettable image.
But here's the thing. Marx wasn't just trying to describe how the system worked. He was also trying to predict its downfall. He believed that this engine of surplus value, the very thing that drove capitalism, also created fatal flaws. Flaws that he thought would eventually tear the whole system apart from the inside out. Let's take a look.
He basically had two big predictions for how capitalism would end. First, he had a social argument, all about class struggle. And second, he had an economic argument about how the system's own internal logic would cause it to self-destruct. All right, so the class struggle argument is probably the one you've heard of. Marx's theory was that, over time, workers would start to develop what he called class consciousness. Basically, they'd look around and realize, hey, we're the ones creating all this extra wealth for somebody else. And that shared feeling of being exploited would, he predicted, lead them to organize, to band together, and ultimately to overthrow the whole system.
But his second argument is just as critical, and maybe even more relevant today. He said the system would basically eat itself alive. Think about it. Competition forces businesses to lower their prices. To stay profitable, they have to cut costs. That usually means lowering wages or replacing people with machines. This constant pressure just squeezes out the little guys, right? And eventually wealth gets more and more concentrated into the hands of a few giant companies. Does any of that sound familiar?
Now look, whether you agree with his predictions or not, one thing is undeniable: the absolutely massive impact these ideas had on the real world.
This wasn't just some academic book collecting dust on a shelf. It became a global force that literally shaped the 20th century.
Just think about this number for a second. By 1987, 1/3, 1 out of every 3 people on the planet, was living under a government that claimed to follow Marx's ideas. 1/3 of the world. The scale of influence is it's staggering. It's hard to even wrap your head around.
And this timeline here gives you a kind of whirlwind tour of that influence. You've got the Russian Revolution in 1917, then the rise of Communist China in 1949. Marx's ideas were at the heart of the biggest conflict of the 20th century. The Berlin Wall, that wasn't just a wall. It was a physical, concrete symbol of a world literally divided by the ideas we're talking about right now.
So naturally, when the Berlin Wall came down and then the Soviet Union collapsed, well, for a lot of people, it felt like the end of the story, a final verdict. Many in the West declared victory, saying, that's it, capitalism won. And Marxism, it was officially tossed into the dustbin of history. But history had other plans. As we talked about at the very beginning of this explainer, that debate, it didn't end in 1991, not by a long shot. In fact, you could argue it's more alive today than it has been in decades.
Okay, now it is absolutely crucial to be clear about the serious critiques of capital, because there are a lot of them. For one, many economists argue his labor theory of value just doesn't work for explaining real-world prices. Others point out that it completely ignores the value created by entrepreneurship, by innovation, by taking risks. And then, of course, there's the huge, undeniable historical link between Marxist-inspired states and totalitarian regimes, plus the powerful argument that maybe the answer isn't revolution, but reforming capitalism through democracy.
And yet, even with all of those very valid critiques, Marx's influence just endures, especially outside of pure economics. His method, this idea of looking beneath the surface of society to find the hidden economic motives behind, well, everything from our politics to our culture, that has fundamentally changed how we study the world.
The modern scholar David Harvey put it really well. He said you don't have to be a Marxist to see capital as a powerful toolbox. It just gives you this unique lens to ask some really tough, critical questions about why our society is built the way it is, and, more importantly, who benefits from it.
And all of this brings us right back to that big final question. When you look at the world today, with rising inequality, with wealth becoming more and more concentrated, with the constant threat of economic crises, you have to ask, has modern capitalism evolved beyond Marxist critique, or are we just seeing echoes of the exact same patterns he described over 150 years ago? That is a question I'll leave with you.